welcome to this episode of The Keys to Therapy. In this episode, we're going to talk about what clinical assessments are and how to do them. So a clinical assessment or a biopsychosocial or an intake, lots of places use lots of different words, but all of that is the first session that you have with a client. So the purpose of the intake is to get to know the client. You want to be able to gather a history of the client, understand a little bit more about like how they grew up, what their family life is like, what their education is, relationships, symptoms, things along those lines. Like you want to know a little bit about everything in their life. So you want to focus on like identifying symptoms so that way maybe you could possibly make a diagnosis and then you can develop a treatment plan based off of that diagnosis. So the first session is really important because, as I mentioned in a previous video about building rapport with clients, in that first session is where you are doing some of the heaviest lifting you will do in the therapy room in general with that client, because the first session is a lot. It's your first impression with the client. It's their first impression of you. It's everything setting up what therapy is going to look like with you for the future. So there's kind of a lot of expectations that are placed on it for yourself, maybe personally, of like, okay, I want to make a good impression. I want to know that the client likes me. I hope that we connect. I hope that my style works well with them. I hope that they're comfortable here. And with the client, there's a lot of nerves on their end of like, I hope this person can help me. I hope that, I share enough of what they need. I'm nervous about sharing too much or sharing too little. I know that they're going to ask about this one thing and I'm kind of scared about talking about it. So there's nerves on both ends sometimes. And typically for the client to even call and make the appointment, that takes a lot of guts. Like that's scary. So for them to walk through the door or to log into the session, that's heavy too. So be mindful of how nervous that person might be and put on your best everything, look warm and smile and nice and all of the things to try to make them feel comfortable, but still stick with your personality too, or it's going to look kind of fake. So, but you kind of want to put on the best face that you could put on and be in tune with them and how nervous they are. So with the assessment, typically clients are given information like a handout packet with like here's a questionnaire, here's consent forms, privacy policies, HIPAA forms, all of those things tend to be in that packet. So you want to make sure that if possible that is completed before the first session so you have some time as a clinician to review it and get an idea of who this person is before the session. Now with the paperwork, sometimes some clients will answer things like yes, no, maybe, I'm not sure, I'll talk about it with you in session, stuff like that. So the paperwork might not always give you a lot of info, but what I found is that most people tend to put at least a couple things in there that will give you something to go off of when you're actually doing the intake. So if they put like trauma history and they write yes, in the intake you can hint on that and be like, hey, so I saw that you wrote yes. Is that something that you want to talk about some more today? Or do you want to save that for future sessions? So you kind of want to take your time with some of the questions, just don't dive into everything. Since the purpose of the first session is to build that rapport and for you to get all of that history, I think some therapists sometimes feel pressure to answer or get the answers for all of the questions. Because it's like, oh my gosh, I've got to make this diagnosis. I'm like, I need all the info. But depending on where you work, you may only have 60 minutes for the intake. You may only have 90 minutes for the intake. You may have 2 hours, but a lot of that depends on your time limit. A lot of it also depends on how talkative the client is. Because if they're really anxious or they don't really want to be there, their parents making them, or, they don't really see that there's a problem, it might be harder to get info out of them. Doesn't matter how much time that you have. So you're going to have to change your approach slightly depending on who the person is in front of you. So today's video is going to be more of like a general assessment, and I'll give you a couple tips here and there on how to deal with different types of clients. So certain sample questions that are going to be on those forms or things that you're going to need to ask and follow up with during the actual intake would be family history, Sometimes it's easier to start there. Like, okay, well, tell me a little bit about your childhood, and have them work their way back. If this is an adult or if it's a teen. Obviously, if it's a kid, it's going to be a little bit different, and we'll talk about that. But for, like I said, an older teen or an adult, you're going to want to ask about like family history, what their childhood was like. You're going to want to ask them questions about like their academics. Did they struggle in school? Did they get up in class a lot? Did they have friendships? Were they involved in extracurriculars? Because all of those things give you insight into who that person was at that period of their life. So that info can be really important of like assessing for ADHD potentially, if they had any academic issues, or if teachers suspected that's maybe what they had going on. Knowing if they had friends and stuff may give you an idea of like how social they are. It also give you a contrast from then to now. Like, you know, oh, I was so social in high school, but as an adult, I've just really retreated. That may be a symptom of something. So you want to ask about the history to get the groundwork of who they were in order to then determine more about who they are and where their normal lies and what their goals are. So you would ask them about, you know, classes that they failed, things like that. Relationship history, you know, friendships and romantic relationships. It's always important to know if there's any kind of issues a person is having socially, or they having romantic issues. You know, you want to ask about like their sexuality or sexual orientation. And with those questions, be very cognizant of how you're asking. So you want to talk to the person and say like, oh, are you currently in a relationship? Not make assumptions that if it's a guy in front of you that you're like, oh, do you have a girlfriend? Because what if they are questioning their sexual identity, or what if they aren't totally comfortable bringing up who they are in the first session? You want to ask an open-ended question that's not going to box them in, because if somebody's making that assumption immediately that they're straight, they're now going to make the assumption that you either are not open enough or aren't a safe person for them to talk to about certain things, and you don't want that to be the impression right off the bat. So make sure that you're asking very open-ended question in terms of those topics. You also want to ask them stuff about like their medical history. It's important to know if they've had any medical issues that have impacted their life or possibly their mental health. So you'll want some questions about that. Family mental health history, so you can get an idea of what may be in their genetics or what they've been exposed to. You'll also want to ask if they've ever been in therapy or ever been on any type of medication for anything mood related, because that would be really helpful in determining history and how long they've had these symptoms, or if they have worked in therapy before, it gives you a platform to like, okay, well, how long did you go to therapy for, and what did you like or didn't you like about your past therapy sessions? And that gives you a ton of information to know of like what their expectations may be for therapy, or what kind of style that they're looking for. So definitely ask those types of questions. And you'll really want to focus too on what their current symptoms are. So what are they feeling? So that's where you'd ask about like sleep. You'd ask about appetite. You'd ask about anxiety. You'd ask about depression, motivation. Have they noticed any big changes in their personality in the last few months? You know, things that may be relevant to what their diagnosis is or what they're experiencing right now. So that helps you determine where to go as far as the diagnosis. So definitely dig into the current symptoms for sure. And you're going to want to make sure that when you are asking these questions, you are making eye contact. You are not just like, and writing stuff down the entire time, because that's going to make it feel a lot more clinical. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, like the number one indicator of how successful the therapy is going to be is the relationship between the therapist and the client. So make sure that you are, again, making eye contact. You're commenting, you know, if they're like, oh, I was in dance in high school. Be like, oh gosh, that's amazing. Like, what type of dance? A question that is not necessarily clinically relevant, but it's relevant to who the person is. So throw in a couple of those here and there too. It also, again, for yourself as a clinician, paints a clearer picture of the person, because in most theoretical orientations, you want to focus on the person, not just the symptoms. So asking those little personal questions here and there, one, shows your interest, but two, shows that you do see them as that whole person. And maybe it'll even give you some information to like relate to the client on, you know, like, oh, my daughter does jazz dancing too. And, or, oh, I've always been interested in that, or I love going to the ballet every year for Christmas, or whatever it is, you just want to have those little human moments in there too. Now, as far as diagnostic info, you want to focus on 3 major things: the frequency of the symptoms, how often are they happening? Is the anxiety something that happens on a daily basis? Is it something that happens like every couple of weeks? So definitely focus on the frequency. Focus on the intensity of the symptoms too. Are these symptoms so intense that you feel physically ill with them? Are these symptoms so intense that you find it hard to control your emotions? Things like that are going to really help you understand what they're actually dealing with. And all of the DSM diagnostic criteria tends to focus on, how frequency and intensity, as well as the third one, duration. So how long have these symptoms been going on for? Is this something that just popped up this month? Is this something that's been happening in the last 3 months? Or is this something that's been happening in the last 3 years? So if it's an adjustment disorder, for example, that's going to be something that's a little bit short term. Maybe like a recent change that just happened that they're really struggling to adjust to, like a new move or starting a new job, or even like a breakup or something. So having the idea of how long those symptoms have been going on is going to help you determine, like, oh, is this an adjustment disorder because these symptoms have only been going on a few months? Or is this actually like generalized anxiety disorder, like major depressive disorder, because they've had this going on for some months or for 6 months, a year? So definitely make sure, again, with diagnostic stuff, you're focusing on frequency, intensity, and duration of the symptoms. So definitely dig into those. Make sure that you are, if you're short on time, make sure that you're making the most of that time. So say you have a talker, right? Like this client comes in and they're like, oh, when, I don't know, in 1979, when I was born, my parents were this. And in 1982, when I went to my first preschool, they told me that. And in 1985, in this grade, I did that. Like, if like they're digging into it, or there's somebody who goes off on a lot of tangents, you ask them the one question about friendships or something, and then they start rattling off all these friends' names and all these issues that have happened with those friends. You're not going to get the info you want. And if you're trying to do an intake in 60 minutes, even 90 minutes, you really can't afford to go into all of that stuff. So that's where you might have to rein them in and be like, hey, this is the first session of many. So I definitely need to hear more about the details. Right now I'm trying to get like an overview so that I can really figure out how best to help you. But I want to write down those friends' names because I do want to get back to that. And you kind of like redirect them to the purpose of the session. I typically, from the get-go, say something like, for the first session, it's basically tell me your whole life in the next hour. So I'm going to ask you a lot of really detailed questions. We're going to go through this whole list that I have to ask. But then from here, we just get to talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about and start working towards your goals. So, you kind of lay out the expectation for the session at the beginning if you can. That's usually really helpful. So say you've had this talker, say you've had to reroute them a bunch of times, or say it's somebody who doesn't really talk at all and they're not really giving you a lot when it comes to history and stuff. The main thing you need in this first session is symptoms. What are their current symptoms? How are they currently feeling? Are they having suicidal thoughts? Are they having homicidal thoughts? You need to know some of these things before this person leaves your room, if you can, or before the session's over. So make sure that if you're looking at the clock and you're like, okay, it's been half an hour and I haven't even really gotten into symptoms, you're like, hey, so we're going to pause right here and let me ask a little bit more about what's going on now, and then we can pick back up with the history. So, tell me, when did these symptoms start? What is it that you're feeling? So it's helpful to give clients a screener if you can before the session starts. So maybe in their intake paperwork packet, and with that, maybe include like the GAD, which is the screener for anxiety, or the PHQ-9, which is a screener for depression, or possibly even there's different screeners for sleep. There's screeners for PTSD type symptoms. So there may be some of those that you want to automatically include in your intake packet. So when you do finally see the client, you can already get an idea of like what those anxiety levels or depression levels or trauma levels look like. And then you can just jump right into the questions like, oh, I see you scored really high here on this question about, not wanting to wake up, or about nightmares or something. Like, do you mind telling me, like, how often do you have those? And it gives you something to go off of. So if possible, try to get your clients to do that before. And if you can't, you can have them fill it out quickly in the session. Most of the screeners are pretty short, like 10 questions or so. So that will give you a lot of info. But again, focus on the current symptoms. So a lot of times with the first session, especially if you are billing insurance, you need some kind of diagnostic code to go off of. So you cannot bill for the session unless you have a diagnosis put on the form, the note, whatever. So it sucks because sometimes that person may leave your room and you're like, I don't know, like their anxiety could be an adjustment disorder because they just went through this big change, but they also said that they've had anxiety in the past. So like maybe it's generalized, or maybe actually because they said that there has been trauma in the past, all of this is really PTSD. Most therapists, doesn't matter how long you've been in the field, there's going to be certain people that are not as clear with their symptoms. It could be like 5 different things. So many of the symptoms overlap anyway in the DSM. So you may need to just put a provisional diagnosis down, which means you have to put something. So you put somewhere in your note, like, provisional diagnosis, and then maybe it is adjustment disorder to start. Maybe it's like anxiety disorder unspecified or something that's like vague, but it gives you room to build off of for future sessions. You don't want to put a heavy label. So my suggestion would be start low and you can work your way to high. So if you suspect PTSD, but you're not totally sure and you need to dig in a little bit more in future sessions, don't put PTSD. Put out on the note something, like I said, like anxiety disorder unspecified. You can always put under it for your own notes, not for billing purposes, but rule out PTSD so that like, okay, this is a consideration, but it's not necessarily the diagnosis I'm going to put down. Because again, you want to start low because you can always work your way up to a higher diagnosis. I've seen people put down like bipolar disorder after one session with somebody. That one is tricky. Like, it might not be bipolar. Maybe it's borderline personality disorder. And you just totally labeled them as bipolar. So labels are tough. And some clients especially latch on to a label and either make that part of their identity, or they can latch onto that label and reject it or really struggle with it. So you don't want to label somebody until you are absolutely sure, like, this is the diagnosis, this is why I made it. And you could justify it if you were audited or if you were directly asked by a client or a supervisor, like, why is this the diagnosis? So again, start small. When you do come up with the diagnosis, even if it is a provisional one, educate the client on it. So there's so many clients that I've seen who are like, I don't know what my diagnosis was. And it's like, well, you've been in therapy for a few years. You might not need to know the exact code, but like maybe know that like you have a depressive disorder. So make sure you're educating your client on it. Like, hey, so it's sounding to me like there may be some traits of PTSD here, but I'm hesitant to put the full diagnosis down until we evaluate you further. So I'm going to put anxiety disorder down now because that is like an umbrella for PTSD, and we'll talk about it further. Or, based on everything you're saying, I'm thinking that it might be dysthymia. It's really sounding like it's dysthymic disorder or persistent depressive disorder. So because of that, I'm thinking that these are the criteria, and this is what it sounds like you are feeling. So tell me, how does that sound to you? And sometimes you could get their input on it. This is supposed to be collaborative. We don't know everything, and we're not the experts on everything. The client's the expert on their life. We're just here to give them some more info to figure out what to do with what they're feeling. So get their input too. So, I've been in sessions where I've pulled out the DSM, where I've looked up the criteria on the computer and been like, okay, here's the criteria for schizotypal disorder or something. Like, how is that sounding to you? Is there any of that you can relate to? And go over it with them. But definitely focus on the current symptoms in order to get the diagnosis. And then from those current symptoms, you can work your way back to, okay, so you mentioned you're feeling this, and this. When did that start? How long has it been going on? And focus again on like the duration of it. Now, part of the intake, and I think this is a part that a lot of people forget because they get very, very caught up in, I've got to get all the questions answered. I've got to fill out all the blanks on this paperwork that, is the agency's intake form or whatever other requirements, because there's like a million requirements that we all have in this field to get all checked off and everything else. So one part a lot of people forget about is talking to the client about how you work. Like, why do they want to work with you? So your credentials aren't enough. Sometimes if they like you, that might not be enough. So make sure somewhere in the assessment, typically I do it towards the very end, is I'll talk to the client about how I work. Give them informed consent about what the therapeutic process looks like when they work with you, especially if they've been in therapy before, because they might have expectations based off their last therapist. But if they've never been in therapy, absolutely make sure you outline to them how it is that you work. So for me, for example, I'll tell clients, hey, I'm not a very formal therapist. I'm not going to give you a ton of books to read or a lot of handouts to go over. There's going to be things that we review here, but most sessions are not going to be like today, where I'm asking you a million questions. Most sessions, you're going to come in, we're going to talk about how the last week or the last 2 weeks has been, and then whatever's the biggest thing there is what we're going to pick up on, and that's what we're going to talk about that day. So you get to bring what you want to sessions. And if there's something that you're not totally sure if you want to talk about it, or if you're like, everything's been good, I'm not sure where to go, then I'll ask specific questions and kind of guide the session a little bit more. But let them know what future sessions look like. People are usually nervous that first session, so the more info you can give them, the better they're going to feel. Maybe the more likely it is that they'll come back if they understand what they're coming back to. So absolutely, in that intake assessment session, talk about how you work, because you're assessing the client, but they're assessing you too. They're looking at your body language. They're looking at if you seem interested in what they're saying. They're looking at if you are understanding what they're talking about. They're looking at your body language, your eye contact, all of those things too. They're trying to figure out, is this person going to be the person to help me? Is this somebody I actually want to open up to? So give them more info about you and how you work. Like I said, it's kind of informed consent as well. Let them know what they may be signing up for so they can make that decision if they want to come back or not. So absolutely include that too. The next part of the assessment, which you typically do after the session on your own, but it is nice to incorporate this with clients maybe in the next session, or at least verbally discuss it, is the treatment plan. So especially if you're dealing with insurances, you're going to need some sort of treatment plan to go off of. I personally don't take insurance in my own practice, but I still develop a treatment plan because it's just kind of like good practice to have. So there's a couple different ways treatment plans work, and my next video is going to be all about treatment plans, so I'll get into that in more detail there. But with the treatment plan, and this is a big question to include in the intake as well, is what are your goals for therapy? You need to know why the client's there. What are they hoping to get out of sessions? What is it that they want to do in the sessions? If their goal is like, I just want to feel better, dig into that a little bit more. Like, okay, well, what would, feeling better look like to you? Like, what does that look like on a daily basis? What does feeling better look like in terms of your career or in terms of your relationships? Dig into it so you get a little bit more detail, a little more clarity on what it is that they actually want. But, with the treatment plan, you are building on the goals. So you're figuring out what the client wants, and you're talking with them about how often you'll meet. So do they want to meet weekly? Do they want to meet every other week for financial reasons, or because they think like, I like the space between sessions so I have time to think or implement stuff we talk about? Is it that they need to talk with you about like scheduling issues or their expectations for therapy, stuff like that? You're gonna want to talk with them all like about all those topics in like the development of the treatment plan. So sometimes you'll talk about it and in the session, and then afterwards you're actually writing out your full treatment plan. But you can't really write that out unless you know what their goals are for therapy. What is it that they want? Because we could set the goals all day, but if they're not the client goals, they're not going to be met. So make sure that you're getting that info for building the treatment plan. Now, some random tips when it comes to the assessment, the first session. The first session's the toughest. So for you and the client, like I mentioned earlier, you might be a little bit nervous with a new person, especially if it's like your first client or your first client at a new place. You're going to be nervous. So just kind of be aware of those nerves and do whatever it is you need to prepare for that. So maybe you're dancing it out before the first session. Maybe you're stretching, maybe you're meditating, maybe you're reviewing their paperwork and taking your own notes on it. Whatever it is that works for you. I know for me, what I like to do is I'll have their intake paperwork, but I take my own notes about, like, here's their answers for it. So either print out their answers or write them out. And then I create a section on my paper that says, like, things to follow up on. So if they wrote yes to trauma, follow up with that. Because you want to make sure that they know you read your paperwork, that you read their paperwork that you gave them. So definitely understand that you're going to be anxious, but so is the client. So do what you can to kind of ease them into the process. Don't jump into questions like the second they sit down. Ask them how their day was, if they found the office okay. The weather's a classic. So, like, ask about that. But make sure you're doing certain things to develop that rapport and connection, because that's what's going to make them want to come back and work on stuff. So make sure you are also talking to them about any money questions or insurance questions. You may not know all of that. Maybe that's something that, like, the receptionist handles, or, the hospital handles, or whatever else. But you can just ask them at least if they have any questions about any of that stuff and offer any clarity you can. So I'll tell my clients something like, okay, well, the system I use is we'll bill you the evening after our session. So if you have any issues with that, just let me know and we can try to work on that. And I just let them know when they're going to be charged. Some people want to know, like, what the copay is going to be, or, if the fees are going to go up, or if there's different fees for different types of sessions. So just make sure that you're asking them if there's any, like, money or insurance related questions that you need to cover or that they may have. Also, big one, talk about the cancellation policy. So let them know, some places have like a 24-hour cancellation policy, some have 48-hour cancellation policy, some don't have any. Like, I know community mental health, I would get no-shows all the time because people would just be like, nah, I don't feel like going today, or something else came up, or oh my God, I totally forgot, because they had a lot of stuff going on. So, some people have a lot that's going on in their lives and they forget. Or you may, like, change the date of the appointment for whatever reason, and now it's not in their normal schedule, so they forgot about it. So make sure you are talking to the client, like, what the cancellation policy is and how they can get in touch with you if they need to cancel. So do you prefer email? Do they call the front desk? Do they text you? Whatever it is. Do they go through your client portal? Like, definitely lay out for them what it is that they need to do to cancel if or when that happens. Also know that sometimes, and I had this happen a lot when I was doing intakes in person, that person may not get the actual intake packet or paperwork until they are physically at your office. So sometimes places will have a policy like show up 30 minutes before your appointment so you can do all the paperwork. And people still show up at the time. So, or they're taking a long time with the paperwork, or it's just so much that they can't really get through all of it. And then you're sitting at your desk looking at the clock like, oh my gosh, if I met with them now, we would only have 60 minutes instead of the 90 minutes. Or we'd only have 40 minutes instead of the 60. If you have to, stop the client from doing the paperwork and just say, hey, I know it's a lot of paperwork, but I want to make sure that we can make the most of the time that we have. So why don't you come back in here and we can complete it together? And then you can go over the paperwork with them if you have to. Or what I've had happen too, if a lot of the paperwork was random things that they had left, like they had actually done the consent for treatment and they had already filled out like the main parts of their history, I would just have them do it after, stay a few minutes after and just fill out the last remaining forms. So whatever works best for you, but you definitely have to prioritize the time with the client versus how much paperwork they've completed beforehand. So that may be something you have to consider too. So just keep an eye on the clock and understand what your limits are. If you're like, okay, if I had to, I could do an intake in 60 minutes, and you just narrow down your focus to more of like the current symptoms, just kind of be aware that sometimes the paperwork does take people a very long time. So you may have to cut that short. And if you don't get everything done, like you don't ask all the questions you wanted to ask and you can't cover everything, then go ahead and, like I said, at the bottom of that note, put something of the intake note, something along the lines of, will complete intake at next session, or will ask additional questions next appointment, something along those lines. One is a reminder for yourself, but also to show why maybe your intake is not as thorough as you would have liked it to be. So it helps to document everything that you can. On a side note too, as a tip, if you were going to see a child, for example, what I typically do, like a younger one, say like, I don't know, like 12 and under or so, I try to meet with the parent alone first, so that the kid's not sitting there while the parent's talking about them, and then bring in both and cover a few household things like, how often are we going to meet and stuff like that, and then meet with the kid alone for the last bit. Normally what I tell the kids at the intake is, and this is for teens too, like, hey, I know most doctor's appointments and stuff like that, a dentist, whoever, your mom's going to be in the room the whole time, but when we meet, it's just going to be us because I'm here for you. So sometimes your parent might join, sometimes your parent might meet with me alone for a little bit, but here's the deal. I can't tell them anything you say unless you are going to hurt yourself, or you're going to hurt someone else, or somebody's hurting you. Other than that, I can't tell your parents anything. So that's what's different about what we do versus what happens at the doctor's or the dentist. So if there's stuff that you want to talk about that you really don't want your parents to know, they don't have to know. I can't tell them. But it's the reverse. If your parents are talking to me, I can be pretty open with you about what they're sharing, and I normally will share. If I've talked to your mom, or I've talked to your dad, I've talked to your guardian, I'm going to let you know that I've talked to them, because I like to be as transparent as possible with you, because I want to make sure that we're honest with each other. And I lay that out. Same thing with teens. I just might change the tone of how I say that. Like, look, I can't tell them what's going on. So, you're failing a class, or you're out here, sneaking your phone at night, whatever. I can't tell them that. But I'm going to be honest with you. If they email me or there's stuff that they're telling me, I'm going to let you know that I talked to your parent, because I don't want any secrets. So you may just like shift your body language or tone depending on who you're talking to. But for that intake, you definitely, especially if it's a younger child, you're going to need a lot more of the parents' input. So you're going to need to meet with them more. Maybe like half and half of the time with the parent, half the time with the kid. So, and you'll find your rhythm with that. If it's family therapy, it's going to be a totally different type of intake. Or if it's couples therapy, totally different type of intake. And I'll have people who do those types of therapy on as guests in the future, so they can kind of shed more light on how that works, because it is a different process. The more people in the room, the more complicated it's going to be. So, but as far as individual therapy goes, everything I mentioned today is definitely kind of the standard for it. You're going to need to know which questions to cover. You're going to need to build up your own rhythm with all of it too. And luckily with this type of work, the more you do it, the more comfortable you are with it. So you'll get to a point you don't even need to go off of some of these like questions to ask or things like that. But I would suggest, if you're a brand new therapist, either you're in school or you just graduated, have a cheat sheet for yourself, whether it's like the actual intake note you're going to have to do, print that out so you have all the questions in front of you so you know what questions to ask, or have the DSM next to you if you need to, or have like almost a script for yourself of like, which things do I need to cover? So like, here's the stuff I have to ask the client, and here's the things I need to share with them about cancellation policies and how I work and how best to communicate with me. Have the cheat sheets available. They just signed a bunch of papers. It's okay if you have a bunch of papers. Like, do what you need to do. Don't feel like, I'm going to look incompetent if I don't memorize everything. No, you're going to be stressed out later if you forget something that you really wanted to cover. So make your cheat sheets before you even see the clients. Or if you've been doing it for a little bit, but maybe you're at a new place with new policies, or maybe you just get kind of nervous sometimes at that first session, have your cheat sheet. Absolutely helps. So I hope that today, covering some of the assessment process, makes things a little bit clearer, more concrete. I know when I was in grad school, it tended to be a lot of like, oh, well, here's the questions you'll have to cover when it comes to clients. And I got like a sample assessment form. That wasn't enough. Like, I want the language to use. I wanted more like concrete things to do. So hopefully this video will give you some of those ideas and suggestions where you can go out and do an assessment and feel like you know a little bit more about what you're doing and how to proceed with that. So Next episode is going to be about treatment plans, so we'll cover the next part of this process. But have a great day. Subscribe below if you want to keep in contact with everything that's going on with my channel. And see you next episode. Bye.